historians. Tonight, we're taking one last quiet walk along the Roman aqueducts. But this time, we're not just following the water. We're tracing its footprints all the way to today. From those towering arches to the faucets in our kitchens, Rome's legacy still flows through every drop. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let us drift into the past, because even a simple splash of water can tell a story that has lasted 2,000 years. Oh, and if you love these calm journeys through history, don't forget to subscribe. It helps keep the stories flowing. Imagine the city of Rome 2,000 years ago. The air is warm, the streets are dusty, and thousands of people are going about their day. Bakers are kneading dough, shopkeepers are setting up their stalls, and someone's donkey is probably blocking the road again. But behind all that noise and bustle, something very quiet is happening. Water is moving. It's flowing, steady and dependable, through channels the average Roman never even thought about. The Romans loved water almost as much as they loved arguing in the forum. Baths, fountains, gardens, even just a sip from a clay cup. Everything depended on clean, steady water. But Rome wasn't sitting next to a mighty, friendly river like the Nile. The Tiber was muddy and unpredictable. Wells could run dry, and rainwater was too unreliable for a growing empire. The Romans did what Romans always did when faced with a problem. They built something big, clever, and sturdy enough to last for centuries. This is where the aqueducts come in. These were not just pipes or ditches. They were carefully planned systems, stretching miles across hills and valleys. They brought water from distant springs and mountains straight into the heart of the city. And they did it so quietly that most people never saw the work. The aqueducts were like the invisible heroes of Roman life, never asking for applause, just doing their job. Now, if you're imagining towering stone arches everywhere, that's only part of the story. Most Roman aqueducts actually ran underground, like shy moles hiding under the earth. Only when they needed to cross a valley or make a dramatic entrance did they rise on graceful arches. The Romans weren't show-offs for no reason. They only built big and visible when it was practical, or when they wanted to impress a visiting senator. Let's pause for a second. Think about how tricky this was. They didn't have lasers, GPS, or even graph paper. Their measuring tools were wooden, their maps were rough sketches. And yet they could plan a water channel over 50 miles long that sloped just enough to keep water moving without spilling over or stopping. It's steep, and the water would rush too fast and damage the channel. Too flat, and it would just sit there. The magic was in that gentle slope, barely noticeable, but perfect. The Roman engineers had a philosophy: build once, build well, and make it last longer than you do. They believed in durability. That's why even today, if you walk near Rome, Enchiems, or Segovia, you might see their aqueduct arches still standing tall. 2,000 years of storms, wars, and wandering goats haven't knocked them down. That's not luck, that's planning. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into gradients and arches and fancy Latin words, let's set the mood. Picture a team of Roman surveyors standing on a hill at dawn. They're wearing simple tunics, maybe grumbling about the early hour. One is holding a groma, kind of cross-shaped surveying tool. Another is fiddling with a korobits, which is basically a very long wooden level with a water-filled groove. They're squinting at the horizon, quietly deciding where the water will flow. There's no hurry. Aqueducts weren't weekend projects. They could take years, even decades, to finish. The decision to build an aqueduct wasn't just about plumbing. It was a statement. We're Rome. We don't settle for muddy water or empty baths. A new aqueduct meant bigger baths, more fountains, cleaner streets, and happier citizens. It was also good politics. Emperors loved to brag about their aqueducts. It was hard to argue with a leader who just gave your neighborhood fresh water and a beautiful fountain. Now, let's talk materials, though only briefly, because we'll dig into that in a later chapter. At this point, Roman engineers are thinking about stone, mortars, and clay pipes. They know some springs are dozens of miles away, but they're not worried. They've done this before. They'll carve tunnels through hills, build bridges across valleys, and line channels with waterproof plaster called opus signium. Step by step, they'll make a river travel where they want it to go. It wasn't glamorous work most of the time. Workers dug trenches under the sun. Stonecutters chipped blocks by hand. Mules dragged carts of materials across rough tracks. And yet, there was a quiet beauty in it, a sense of purpose. Every shovel of dirt and every stone block meant water for thousands. And here's a fun thought. Most Romans never even knew how far their water traveled. They might fill a jug at a fountain, splash it on their faces, and never realize that water had spent days gliding along underground channels, through dark tunnels, and across elegant bridges just to get there. In a way, that's what makes aqueducts magical. They were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So why does this matter to us now? Because those aqueducts aren't just ruins or tourist attractions. They're a reminder that careful planning and steady effort can make something last for millennia. And they whisper a lesson. Sometimes the most impressive feats are the ones you notice every day. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk slowly, because this is bedtime. After all through every stage of building a Roman aqueduct, we'll talk about picking the perfect spring, measuring slopes without a calculator, mixing mortars that outlasted empires, and stacking arches so well they're still standing. We'll meet clever engineers, grumpy workers, and maybe a few lazy donkeys along the way. For now, just let the image sink in. A quiet stream high in the hills, clear and cold. A line scratched in the dirt by a Roman surveyor's stick. A promise of water for a city miles away. The work hasn't even started yet, but the idea is there. Simple, patient, and unhurried, like the flow of water itself. Imagine it's early morning in the countryside, outside ancient Rome. The sky is pale blue, the grass is damp, and a few sleepy birds are hopping around looking for breakfast. A group of Roman engineers trudges up a hill, rubbing their eyes and carrying wooden tools. One of them probably stayed up too late at the baths the night before. But there's no rushing. Rome builds slowly, and today's task is surveying. Surveying sounds boring, and, well, it kind of is, but it's the quiet heart of any aqueduct. Before the first shovel of dirt, before the first stone arch, someone has to figure out where the water should go. You can't just point downhill and hope for the best. Rome wasn't a place for guesswork. They wanted water to arrive gracefully, not crash through someone's kitchen. The first step was picking the water source. Springs were the gold standard, clean, reliable, and usually cold. A clear mountain spring could feed a city for centuries if handled right. But sometimes, rivers or lakes had to do, even if the water needed settling tanks to remove silt. Choosing badly could doom the whole project, so surveyors took their time. They tasted the water, looked for signs of purity, and checked the flow through every season. Patience was their secret weapon. Now, with the source picked, the team had to plan the route. This meant walking lots of walking. They'd follow ridges, weave through valleys, and sometimes stop to argue over the best path. The perfect aqueduct route avoided steep cliffs, unstable marshes, and tricky landowners. A steep valley could mean building an expensive bridge. Swamp could swallow foundations whole. The ideal path was like a lazy snake. Smooth, steady, and avoiding drama. Let's peek at their toolkit. One of the surveyors plants a groma into the earth. Picture a wooden cross with hanging plumb lines. It looks almost like a child's toy, but it could lay out straight lines and right angles with surprising accuracy. Another man sets up a korobetsa, long wooden beam with a groove filled with water. The water sat perfectly level, so did the beam. It's basically a Roman spirit level, but slower and more elegant. Every few paces, they'd check their angle, squint at distant hills, and mumble calculations. They didn't need perfection, just consistency. The gradient they aimed for was almost invisible, about 1 part drop and thousands of parts length. Stand beside an aqueduct route, and you might not even notice the slope. But over miles, that gentle decline kept the water moving steadily. Without splashing over the edges or pooling in sad little puddles, this wasn't glamorous work. Surveyors weren't the heroes celebrated on statues. They were the quiet planners. Still, a good surveyor could save a city a fortune. A single, clever choice, like routing around a hill instead of tunneling through it, could cut years off construction time. And you can bet they reminded everyone of that fact later over wine. Sometimes they'd have to mark out inspection shafts, called putai, for the underground sections. These were like little skylights for the aqueduct places where workers could climb down to clean or fix things later. A sloppy surveyor might forget them, and future crews would curse his name. So they were careful, leaving small cairns of stones or scratched symbols on rocks to show where shafts should go. The terrain could be tricky. Hills, valleys, and stubborn farmers stood in their way. If the landowners didn't want to trench through their vineyard, engineers had to negotiate or just reroute quietly. Romans were practical. but they also knew not to start unnecessary feuds with a man holding a pitchfork. One fascinating thing about Roman surveying is how little technology they needed. No satellites, no computers, just sticks, string, water, and patience. And yet the results were astonishing. Even today, if you follow some surviving aqueduct lines, you'll see how gracefully they snake across the landscape, hugging the contours of hills, slipping through forests, and gliding over valleys. It's like they were drawn by a steady, careful hand. Let's imagine the survey team stopping for lunch. They sit on a rock under a scraggly olive tree, unwrapping simple bread and cheese. One man points toward the horizon where Rome lies, still out of sight. "The city will drink from this spring," he says. The others nod. They're tired, but there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing their work will outlast them. They joke about the lazy donkey that wandered off earlier. Someone sketches a rough map on a bit of parchment, marking ridges, streams, and future arches. It doesn't look like much yet, but it's the first sketch of something that will last for millennia. After lunch, they check the flow again. The gradient is still right. The path avoids that soggy marsh. The hills are manageable. A few trees will have to come down, but that's tomorrow's problem. They drive a small wooden stake into the earth to mark the line and move on. One step, one hill, one valley at a time. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows. The survey team's sandals kick up little clouds of dust as they walk back toward their camp. Behind them lies a faint line of stakes and scratched symbols, a promise of water that will someday glide silently into Rome's fountains. Surveying and site selection wasn't dramatic. No battles, no marble statues, no cheering crowds. But without it, every grand arch and beautiful fountain you've seen in photos would never have existed. The Romans understood that greatness starts with quiet, careful planning. So next time you sip water from a tap or hear it hum through pipes in your wall, think of those patient surveyors. They measured, argued, and walked miles just to get the slope right. They didn't rush. They didn't need glory. They just followed the hills, listened to the land, and trusted that water, given a little guidance, would do the rest. Let's pick up where we left the Roman surveyors. They found their spring, marked their stakes, and probably complained about their sandals. Now comes the step that would make or break an aqueduct: planning the gradient and the route. This sounds a little math heavy, but don't worry, we're keeping it easy and sleepy. The gradient was everything. Too steep, and the water would rush down like a stampede of angry goats, eroding the channel walls and splashing everywhere. Too flat, and it would just sit there, lazy as a cat in the sun, refusing to move. The Romans aimed for a slope so gentle, you'd barely notice it, something like 1 part drop for every 4,800 parts length. Over a mile, that's just a couple of feet. Imagine walking on a path that feels flat, but over miles, guides a stream perfectly. That's Roman precision. So how did they plan this without computers or calculators? They trusted their tools and their patience. The chorobates, that long wooden beam with a water-filled groove, came out again. They'd place it carefully, wait for the water to settle, and check the bubble well. Not a bubble, but the level of the water. It was slow, but slow was good. Aqueducts weren't built in a hurry. Now, choosing the route was like solving a gentle puzzle. The water had to get to Rome, but the land wasn't going to make it easy. Hills blocked the way. Valleys yawned between ridges. Marshes waited to swallow foundations. The surveyors walked, paused, squinted, and sometimes backtracked. They weren't looking for the shortest path. They were looking for the easiest path, the one that meant fewer bridges, fewer tunnels, and less expensive engineering headaches. Imagine them standing on a hilltop, staring across the countryside. To the left, a valley that would need a towering bridge. To the right, a forest that might hide marshy ground. Straight ahead, a ridge that could require years of tunneling. They'd talk, point, and argue. Maybe one young surveyor, eager to impress, would suggest tunneling through the ridge to get a weary look from the older engineer who's been through this before. "No, we'll go around," the elder would mutter. "It's longer, but we'll still be alive when it's done." This kind of decision-making wasn't just practical, it was economical. Every arch, every tunnel, every carved stone cost labor and money. Rome's coffers were deep, but not bottomless. The smartest engineers made the water work with the land instead of fighting it. When a valley couldn't be avoided, they'd start thinking about arches, or, in rare cases, verted siphons, systems of pipes to carry water across low points. But that was Plan B. Plan A was always to stay on high ground, letting gravity do all the work. Sometimes the route would hug the contour of a hill for miles, curving gently like a ribbon. From above, it might look like the aqueduct was wandering aimlessly, but every curve was a deliberate choice. A straight line may be the shortest distance between 2 points, but for a Roman aqueduct, a lazy curve was often the safest. Let's follow them a little farther. The sun is high, and the countryside smells of thyme and dry earth. A donkey snorts impatiently he's tired of standing around while the humans argue about gradients. One engineer drives another stake into the ground, marking another segment of the future channel. Each stake is a small promise that water will glide this way someday. Sometimes small adjustments made big differences. Tiny change in slope here might mean avoiding a massive construction project miles later. The Romans were masters of thinking ahead. They didn't just look at the next hill, they looked at the whole journey. That's why many aqueducts seem to flow effortlessly across the land. They were planned with a wide view, like someone sketching with a steady hand across a giant map. And the beauty of their approach was patience. If they needed to reroute to avoid a difficult spot, they didn't panic. They simply walked a little farther, scratched new lines in the dirt, and kept going. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were its aqueducts. At night, back at their camp, they'd unroll their rough maps by the fire. The flicker of flames would light up the parchment as they traced the day's progress. Maybe someone poured watered wine into a cup, and another broke off a piece of bread. They'd nod quietly, pleased that today's measurements lined up just right. Imagine being one of those engineers, knowing that your quiet decisions, the angle of a line, the curve of a path would shape a structure people might admire thousands of years later. But they weren't thinking about us. We're thinking about water, how to get it home without fuss. One could argue that Roman aqueduct routes are like the best kind of life advice. Don T. Rush. Don't fight the hills too hard, and let things flow where they want to go. Just gently guide them. So, with the gradient set and the route chosen, the surveyors could rest easy for a while. The big decisions were made. Soon, the heavy work of digging, lining channels, and stacking arches would begin. But for now, the countryside was quiet. The stakes marked the path, and the future waterway existed only in their minds and a few scratched lines on parchment. As the campfire dies down, the donkey finally gets his hay, and the hills fade into darkness. Tomorrow will bring more measuring, more walking, and more small choices that will someday lead to mighty arches on the horizon. But tonight, the engineers drift to sleep, probably dreaming of water flowing perfectly down a slope so gentle you could barely see it. By now, our Roman engineers have their gradient and route figured out. The stakes are in place, the maps are rolled up, and the donkey who has finally forgiven yesterday's long hike is happily chewing hay. But an aqueduct can't be built on plans alone. It needs stuff, lots and lots of stuff. Stones, mortars, bricks, wood, even a bit of lead and clay. This is where sourcing and preparing materials begins. First up, stone. The Romans weren't picky just to be difficult. They had reasons for every choice. Tufa, a soft volcanic stone, was easy to cut and shape, perfect for sections that didn't need to carry huge loads. For heavier work, they liked travertine, which was stronger and prettier too. Travertine blocks could handle arches and pillars that had to bear weight for centuries. Limestone was another favorite, common, dependable, and forgiving to work with. The engineers knew the local quarries like bakers know their ovens. They'd pick sites close enough to save hauling time, but far enough to avoid unstable ground. Imagine a quarry at sunrise. Workers with simple chisels and hammers start tapping the rock face. Wedges of wood soaked in water to split blocks. The sound is steady, almost soothing. Dust floats in the air like faint morning mist. There's no rush. Quarrying isn't a sprint. Each stone block is coaxed free, trimmed, and dragged onto a wooden sled. Somewhere, a foreman is muttering about the quality of today's cut, and a mule is already rolling its eyes at the workload. Now let's talk mortar, the invisible glue holding everything together. Roman mortar was magic well. Almost used pozzolana, a volcanic ash that, when mixed with lime and water, created a concrete that could set underwater. That's right, underwater. This mix is why so many Roman structures, including aqueducts, still stand today. The engineers would carefully sift the ash, measure the lime, and mix in clean water. Too dry and it would crumble. Too wet and it would slump. Getting it just right was a quiet art passed from mason to mason. For lining channels, they used opus signinum, a special waterproof plaster made of crushed tiles and lime. It was spread smooth inside the water channels to prevent leaks. Picture a worker crouched inside a half-finished channel, humming softly while smoothing the plaster with a wooden trowel. The goal wasn't beauty, it was function. A leak meant wasted water and angry city officials. Bricks and tiles were also essential. Romans made them from local clay, shaped by hand or with simple molds, then fired and kilned. The bricks weren't the glossy, perfect rectangles we know today. Each was slightly irregular, giving aqueduct walls a subtle, human touch. Workers would stack them on carts or carry them in baskets, their fingers dusted red from the clay. Wood played its part, too, though not as a permanent material. Timber was used for scaffolding, temporary supports, ramps, and sleds. Tall wooden frames would rise beside the growing arches, giving masons platforms to stand on. When the stones were locked in place, the wood could be dismantled and reused farther along the route. Nothing was wasted if it could be helped. Occasionally, the engineers would need lead pipes or bronze fittings, especially for siphons or small urban distribution lines. Lead was expensive and had to be used sparingly. Craftsmen melted it, poured it into simple molds, and hammered the cooled pipes into shape. The work was hot and dirty, but the results were flexible and reliable. Sourcing materials wasn't always smooth sailing. Sometimes the best stone was on the other side of a hill, or the clay deposits weren't as rich as expected. The engineers would weigh the effort of hauling heavy blocks against the benefit of better quality. They usually chose the path of patience, a little more walking, a little more hauling, but fewer headaches later. Picture the supply chain slowly taking shape. Carts creak under loads of stone. Workers stack bricks under a canvas awning. Buckets of pozzolana are lined up near a mixing pit. A mason tests a mortar batch by pressing it between his fingers, nodding in approval. The air smells faintly of dust, wet clay, and olive oil from someone's lunch. Even the timing of material preparation mattered. Mortars couldn't be mixed too early or too late. Kilns had to run hot but not too hot. The Romans didn't have spreadsheets or scheduling software, they had experience. Gossip and maybe a few chalk marks on a wall, and yet everything managed to line up. Let's not forget the donkeys and oxen. Without them, nothing moved. These four-legged workers hauled stone, clay, and timber mile after mile. Somewhere in the background, a donkey brays indignantly, as if to remind everyone he's the real hero of Roman engineering. As dusk falls, the worksite quiets. A half-built pile of stone blocks glows golden in the sunset. The tools are stacked neatly, and the last embers of a brick kiln flicker in the distance. Tomorrow will bring more cutting, mixing, and hauling. But for now, there's a sense of calm accomplishment. The Romans understood that great structures start long before the first wall goes up. They start with careful choices, which stone to trust, which ash to mix, which path to follow. The aqueduct's strength and beauty were decided in quarries and kilns, not just on the arches we marvel at today. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet rhythm of quarry chisels, the swish of plaster smoothed on stone, and the slow creak of a cart heading toward the next worksite. The aqueduct isn't built yet, but its bones, its very essence, are already here, waiting patiently in piles of stone and buckets of ash. The Roman engineers are ready to dig. The route is staked, the stone is stacked, and the donkey's heroes of logistics are probably already rolling their eyes. But before the big, showy arches rise against the sky, most aqueducts begin quietly beneath your feet. Underground channels were the hidden lifelines of Roman water engineering, and building them was a patient art. Why go underground? Simple, it was safer. Underground channels didn't have to fight the wind or frost or mischievous kids throwing rocks at them. Buried stone is protected from weather, from invaders, from the kind of goats that would happily climb anything tall just to show off. Underground construction also kept the water cooler and cleaner. The Romans weren't just being chef, they were being practical. The first step was digging a trench or tunnel along the surveyed route. Picture a line of workers in simple tunics, leaning on their picks. The sun beats down. Someone hums a tune that's been passed down through generations of laborers. Picks and shovels scrape the earth in a slow, steady rhythm. They don't rush. Rushing leads to collapses, and collapses lead to very grumpy foremen. When a hill stood in the way, the Romans didn't always go over it or around it, they went through it. They dug tunnels, sometimes stretching hundreds of meters. To speed up the process, they sank vertical shafts called putai along the route. Imagine small, circular wells spaced out like stepping stones on a hill. Teams would dig from the top down and from both ends toward the middle, meeting underground like old friends shaking hands. This method saved time and provided ventilation for the workers below. Inside these tunnels, the walls weren't left as bare dirt. The Romans lined them with stone or concrete, smoothing the interior so water could flow without snagging on rough edges. Then came the opus signinum, that special waterproof plaster of crushed tile and lime. Workers would kneel in the half-light, smoothing the plaster with practiced strokes. You can almost hear the soft scraping sound echoing down the tunnel. The channels themselves, called spicus, were often narrow and not very tall, just big enough for a worker to squeeze through for maintenance. Nobody planned for comfort, they planned for function. To inspect them later, workers would crawl or walk bent over, like sneaky ghosts wandering under the hills. Building underground meant dealing with surprises. Sometimes the soil was too loose, and a tunnel roof would need extra stone supports. Sometimes groundwater seeped in, forcing crews to dig drainage trenches or line the channel more carefully. Every problem was met with patience. Nothing about aqueduct construction was fast or flashy. Above ground, small cairns of stones or wooden stakes marked the shafts. Passers-by might not even guess that, beneath their sandals, a future waterway was slowly taking shape. Farmers could still work their fields while, meters below, the Romans carved a path for a distant spring. Let's imagine a midday break. The workers emerge from a shaft, dusty and tired. They sit under a scraggly olive tree, chewing bread and olives. One of them jokes about the gods being upset with the route. Why else would they keep hitting hard rock? Laughter rolls through the group, quiet but warm. Then, with a sigh, they descend back into the cool earth, their flickering oil lamps disappearing into darkness. Some underground sections included settling tanks, small widened areas where sediment could drop out of the water before it continued on. This kept the channels from clogging and saved future workers a headache. The tanks were easy to clean through the putai shafts, like giving the aqueduct a little bath every now and then. The Romans understood that what people don't see is just as important as what they admire. Those majestic arches tourists photograph today are only a small part of the aqueduct system. Most of the work and most of the genius was hidden under hills and fields. By nightfall, the tunnel crews climbed out again, shoulders sore and sandals dusty. The shafts they dug looked like tiny, lonely wells in the moonlight. Each one was a silent promise. Water will flow here someday. It's a promise to future bathers, bakers, and gardeners who won't even know to thank them. There's a kind of humility in that. The underground channels didn't shout for attention. They weren't decorated or shown off. They just did their job quietly, reliably, and for centuries. As you picture those workers lowering lamps into a dark shaft, imagine the cool air down there, the gentle scrape of a trowel smoothing plaster, and the soft splash of a distant trickle finding its way home. The aqueduct isn't visible yet, but under the hills, under the farms and donkey paths, Rome's lifeblood is beginning to flow. The Romans were never shy about showing off. After all those hidden underground channels, it's time for some drama. Elevated arches were the aqueduct's stage presence, the part that made passers-by stop, squint up, and mutter, "Wow." If an aqueduct were a theater performance, the arches were the dancers twirling under the spotlight. So, why arches? Simple. The ground doesn't always cooperate. Hills dip, valleys stretch wide, and rivers cut rude gaps in the landscape. Carrying water straight across flat earth is easy, but nature rarely hands you a flat earth. By raising the channels on arches, the Romans could keep their precious gradient without carving entire mountains. First came careful planning. A team of surveyors, likely sunburned, possibly arguing over who misplaced the plumb line measured and marked the valley. They decided where each pier the vertical supports would go. Every pier had to be spaced just right, too far apart, and the arch would collapse. To close, and you'd waste stone and time. Workers started with deep foundations. Picture men in dusty tunics digging big square holes, muttering about rocks that refused to move. They filled these holes with rubble and lime mortars, pounding it down until solid. These foundations were like invisible heroes. No one praised them. But without them, the arches would wobble like a toddler learning to walk. Then came the piers. Layer by layer, stones were stacked and mortared. The Romans used ashlar block scut stones that fit together like puzzle pieces, or sometimes rougher rubble with lots of mortar. Either way, they worked slowly, checking plumb lines to make sure each pier stood straight. A leaning pier meant disaster later. Once the piers reached the right height, the magic moment arrived. Building the arch itself. Wooden scaffolds and frames called centering were set up between piers. These wooden ribs would hold the stones in place until the arch was complete. The air probably smelled of sawdust and sweat. You can almost hear the creak of wood as workers climbed up with baskets of stones. The arch stones, or voussoirs, were carefully shaped wedges. Workers laid them one by one on the centering, each stone leaning on the next. The final stone, the keystone, was like the last piece of a puzzle. As it slid into place, the whole structure locked together. Remove the centering, and if the geometry was good, the arch stood proud, holding its own weight. Remove the centering too early, though, and you'd get a Roman version of slapstick comedy, with stones clattering and foremen yelling. Many aqueduct arches were built in rows, creating those breathtaking multi-tiered structures you see in old postcards. To build multiple levels, the Romans simply repeated the process. More piers on top of existing arches, and more arches on those piers. The trick was balancing weight so the lower arches didn't buckle under the new load. They used lighter materials higher up, and sometimes narrowed the channels to reduce weight. Above the topmost arch, they placed the spicus, the water channel itself. It was lined with waterproof plaster, just like the underground sections. Small inspection paths ran alongside so workers could check for leaks. From the ground, though, all anyone saw was an elegant series of arches marching across the landscape, as if Rome had decided the horizon needed decorating. Building elevated arches wasn't just about engineering. It was also a show of Roman power. Picture a sleepy provincial town waking up to see a line of arches creeping across its valley. That's not just water delivery, that's a message. Rome cares enough to bring you water. It's want to also remind you who's in charge. Life around the construction site was busy, but surprisingly routine. Stonecutters chipped away at blocks nearby, sending up puffs of dust. Donkeys hauled sand and mortar. Children probably hovered at the edges, daring each other to sneak closer to watch the arches rise. Somewhere, a foreman kept a tablet full of numbers and notes, scratching his head over tomorrow's pier spacing. Accidents could happen, of course. A poorly tied rope could send a stone tumbling. A cracked voussoir might need replacing. But Roman builders were methodical. Lessons learned from one arch carried over to the next. Over time, building elevated aqueducts became second nature, almost boring to the workers. To a passerby, though, watching an arch rise must have been like watching magic. At sunset, the half-finished arches cast long, graceful shadows over the fields. Farmers returned from work and glanced at the growing skeleton of stone against the sky. The aqueduct wasn't just a project, it was a promise of fountains that would gurgle in the forum, baths that would steam on chilly mornings, and gardens that would bloom without fear of drought. When the last keystone was set and the scaffolding removed, the arches stood silently, patient and proud. They didn't shout their purpose. They simply carried water, day after day, century after century. Even now, some of those same arches still stand in Spain and France, weathered but unbroken. So next time you see a picture of those towering Roman arches, remember, they're more than stone and mortar. They're the frozen footprints of thousands of ordinary workers, of donkeys trudging through dust, of surveyors squinting at the horizon. They're the places where engineering met artistry and made something timeless. At this point, the Romans have dug underground tunnels and raised arches that could impress the gods themselves. But a channel without a lining is like a bread loaf without a crust, messy and disappointing. The speakers, that's the fancy name for the water channel, needed to be smooth, waterproof, and strong enough to handle centuries of thirsty citizens. Let us start with the basics. A Roman water channel was in T, just an open ditch. It was a carefully shaped trough, often rectangular or slightly arched on top, to keep dust, leaves, and ambitious pigeons out. The bottom was sloped ever so gently, just enough to keep the water moving without turning it into a roller coaster ride. That gentle slop, about a finger's width drop per 100 feet, was the secret to avoiding chaos downstream. Before lining the channel, builders smoothed the stone base. Any bumps or gaps could snag debris, create turbulence, or worst of all, leak water. Leaks meant angry bathhouse owners, and nobody wanted to face an angry Roman missing their warm soak. Next came the hero of this chapter, opus signum. This wasn't some exotic potion, just crushed terracotta tiles mixed with lime mortars. But oh, it was magical. Workers would grind old tiles into a red powder, mix it with lime and water, and then spread the paste inside the channel. The result? A waterproof, durable surface that resisted leaks. Think of it as the Roman version of a non-stick pan coating. Except instead of pancakes, it carried drinking water. Imagine a group of workers kneeling inside a half-built aqueduct, sunlight flickering through scaffolding. They scoop up the crimson paste with wooden trowels, pressing it firmly into every crack. The smell of lime mingles with dust and warm air. One worker makes a joke about painting the empire red, literally. Laughter echoes through the hollow arches. Sometimes, to make the channels even tougher, the Romans lined the bottom with flat stone slabs before applying the plaster. In important or heavily trafficked aqueducts, they even vaulted the top of the channel with stone or brick, forming a tunnel to protect the water from sunlight, animals, and adventurous kids who might otherwise try to dip a toe in. Water channels weren't just straight lines either. They included inspection shafts, settling basins, and little side passages to divert excess water or let silt settle. In some cases, a tiny staircase led down so a maintenance worker could climb in for a quick cleaning. Picture a guy with a broom, muttering under his breath about whoever threw a twig into the flow miles upstream. One clever feature was the use of cover stones, flat slabs laid on top of open channels. These protected the water while still allowing access for repairs. A visitor walking along an aqueduct route might not even realize there was a stream humming beneath their sandals. But what about corners and joints? The Romans knew that sharp angles can slow water or cause leaks. They smoothed every corner into a gentle curve. Even inside a structure meant to be boringly functional, they couldn't help but think about flow and beauty. It's like they believed the water deserved a pleasant journey, not a bumpy ride. Every now and then, decorative touches crept in. A mason might carve a simple pattern into a stone slab or leave an initial in a hidden corner. No one was supposed to notice, but maybe centuries later, an archaeologist would smile at the secret signature. By evening, when the day's plastering was done, the workers rinsed their trowels in a bucket, wiped their foreheads, and admired the smooth, glistening channel. They knew that tomorrow, another stretch of Spicus would take shape. It was repetitive work, but there's comfort in repetition. Stone by stone, tile by tile, the aqueduct grew like a living thing. The lining wasn't just for leaks. It also protected the water's taste and cleanliness. Without it, minerals and soil could cloud the water. A good lining meant clear, cool water for fountains, baths, and kitchens miles away. The people of Rome probably never thought about the opus signum under their feet, but they sure noticed when their fountains ran sweet and steady. The real artistry of these channels is how quietly they did their job. No fancy ornaments, no dramatic statues, just smooth, unassuming plaster guiding water across valleys, under hills, and into cities. Even now, fragments of lined channels survive, their reddish plaster still clinging to ancient stones. Close your eyes and picture it. Sunlight dances on the top of an open channel. A breeze rustles through nearby olive trees, and a trickle of water glides over a lining made by hands that have been dust for 2,000 years. Somewhere, a mason's laugh is frozen in time, echoing faintly in the arches. The Romans didn't line their channels for glory. They did it because reliability mattered. And in that simple choice, they gave their aqueducts the gift of endurance. By now, you've marched with the Romans across hills, under fields, and over valleys. The valleys get deeper, rivers get wider, and sometimes the landscape just refuses to cooperate. That is, when the Romans reached into their engineering bag of tricks and pulled out three favorites: bridges, tunnels, and siphons. These weren't flashy experiments, they were dependable, problem-solving workhorses. Bridges. Stone giants across valleys. Imagine you're a Roman engineer, staring at a gaping valley. Your gradient is precious. You can't just let the water tumble down and climb back up again. The solution? Build a bridge. But not just any bridge. A carefully spaced sequence of arches, each one whispering, "I've got your back," to the next. Construction began like it did for the elevated arches you met earlier, only on a grander scale. Deep foundations were sunk into the valley floor, even if that meant hauling rubble down a slippery slope. Piers rose like giant stone dominoes, and scaffolds webbed the air. Somewhere, a donkey was regretting its life choices. Bridges like the Pont du Gard in France became monuments in their own right. Tall, elegant, and perfectly proportioned, they didn't just carry water, they carried Roman pride. Villagers passing beneath probably craned their necks and muttered, "Rome sure knows how to make an entrance." Tunnels, digging through obstacles. But what if the valley wasn't the problem, a mountain was? The Romans didn't waste time wrapping aqueducts around hills like ribbon on a gift. They went straight through. Tunneling wasn't glamorous. It was damp, dark, and smelled like sweat and lamp oil, but it worked. To speed things up, engineers sank vertical shafts at intervals, creating multiple digging points. Teams worked toward each other, hoping to meet neatly in the middle. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they missed by a few feet and had to awkwardly carve sideways, like guests trying to find the right door at a dinner party. Inside, workers lined the tunnel walls with stone or mortar, smoothing them like a potter shaping clay. You could almost hear the soft scraping echo in the half-light. Ventilation shafts brought in fresh air and allowed smoke from oil lamps to escape, which probably saved more than a few headaches. Siphons. When the land drops too low, then there were places where even a bridge wouldn't. T cut it like a valley so deep and wide that spanning it would take a lifetime of stone cutting. Enter the inverted siphon. Despite the fancy name, it's a simple idea. Use pipes to dip water down one side of the valley and back up the other, like a watery roller coaster. The Romans used lead or terracotta pipes, joined carefully to avoid leaks. The key was maintaining enough pressure for the water to climb again on the far side. Picture a line of pipes snaking down into a valley, disappearing into the greenery, and re-emerging triumphantly on the other slope. From afar, villagers might have wondered if the gods had dropped a giant bracelet across the land. Setting up a siphon wasn't easy, as too much pressure could burst a pipe, creating an accidental fountain nobody ordered. Too little pressure, and the water would sulk at the bottom of the valley. Engineers calculated gradients, pipe diameters, and support structures with care. And yes, sometimes they guessed and learned the hard way. Somewhere out there, a Roman foreman probably shouted, "I told you it needed thicker pipes," as water sprayed everywhere, blending techniques. Often, a single aqueduct used all three solutions. A stretch might run underground, pop out onto arches, then dip through a siphon before tunneling again. The Romans weren't rigid, they adapted. Their goal wasn't to make the landscape bow to them, but to work with it, gently nudging it into cooperation. Walking along a half-finished aqueduct would have been like touring a giant outdoor workshop. Over here, men hauled stones for a bridge. Over there, dusty laborers vanished into a tunnel shaft. Down in the valley, crews wrangled pipes into place. The scene buzzed with quiet industry, nothing frantic, just a patient confidence that water would soon flow. At sunset, as tools were packed away, the skeletons of bridges glowed gold in the fading light. Smoke curled from campfires near the tunnel entrances. Someone probably strummed a lyre, its soft notes mingling with the sounds of distant hammering. It was ordinary life in the service of extraordinary engineering. Even now, when you stumble upon a ruined aqueduct bridge or peer into an old tunnel mouth, you're seeing the bones of that careful planning. A fragment of pipe or a faint siphon root carved into rock is like a whisper from 2,000 years ago. We thought of everything, even this valley. So next time you see a picture of a Roman aqueduct crossing a gorge or vanishing into a hill, take a moment to appreciate the quiet cleverness behind it. The bridges, tunnels, and siphons didn't just carry water, they carried Rome's determination to connect faraway springs to thirsty cities, no matter what the earth threw in their path. An aqueduct wasn't just something you built and then forgot about. Water is stubborn, it leaks, it erodes, it collects silt, and it invites every root and pebble to join the party. The Romans knew that even the mightiest arches and smoothest channels would eventually need a little TLC. Maintenance wasn't glamorous, but without it, the baths would run dry. Fountains would sputter, and bakers would complain loudly about dry dough. Routine checkups. The Roman way maintenance started with routine inspections. Teams of aqueduct water workers walked the length of aqueduct routes, peering into channels, tapping stones, and checking for signs of trouble. They didn't rush, they ambled, probably sharing gossip about the latest market prices, or who bought a new pair of sandals. Their job was to catch little problems before they became big disasters. Those putti shafts you met in the underground chapters? They weren't just for construction, they doubled as handy access points. A worker could climb down, lantern in hand, and shuffle through the narrow spikas to look for cracks or debris. Imagine crawling through a dim tunnel while muttering about the guy upstream who tossed a branch into the water. Cleaning and clearing sediment was a constant nuisance. Even the clearest spring water carries tiny bits of sand or silt. Over time, those bits settle in the channels, slowly narrowing the flow. Roman crews scraped and shoveled the muck out by hand, dumping it outside like an offering to the gods of cleanliness. Settling tanks wider sections of the channel made their job easier by catching heavier particles. Before they reached the city, roots were another headache. Trees are sneaky. They love water, and their roots will wiggle into the smallest cracks to sip from the aqueduct. Workers had to cut those roots back, patch the gaps, and probably curse the tree for its audacity. Repairing cracks and leaks, cracks were patched with fresh mortars or opus signinum. If a stone had shifted, masons reset it and braced the structure. Sometimes, entire sections had to be rebuilt. Picture a small team of laborers carefully removing damaged stones, placing them one by one, and sealing the seams while the summer sun bakes the valley. Above-ground arches faced wind, rain, and the occasional earthquake. A bridge might lose a voussoir or two over the years. When that happened, scaffolding went up, ropes creaked, and workers balanced high above the ground to set new stones. The view was probably incredible if you weren't too busy gripping the rope in fear. Seasonal worries, winter could be cruel. In colder regions, water in cracks might freeze and expand, widening gaps. Romans prepared by applying extra plaster or diverting flow during the worst weather. Heavy rains could wash out foundations or erode hillsides, so inspection routes often took longer after a storm. Somewhere, a supervisor probably grumbled, "The gods must be testing our patience again." Emergency fixes, not all repairs were routine. A sudden collapse could disrupt an entire city's water supply. In emergencies, crews scrambled to divert flow using temporary wooden channels or siphons while rebuilding. These moments weren't calm or boring. They were frantic sprints to keep Rome hydrated. But even in a crisis, Roman organization shone through. They had spare materials on hand, and every worker knew their role, graffiti and notes from the past. While crawling through aqueducts, workers sometimes left graffiti, a name, a date, a quick doodle. These little signatures are still found today, a reminder that real people maintained these mighty works. You can almost picture a tired Aquarius carving "Marcus was here" after patching a crack, hoping someone someday would notice. At the quiet success of maintenance. When everything worked perfectly, nobody thought about the maintenance crews. The baths stayed warm, the fountains danced, and the gardens thrived. It's thankless work till the moment something fails. Then suddenly, everyone cares. The Romans understood this, which is why maintenance was baked into their aqueduct system from day one. Even emperors supported repair efforts. Coins and inscriptions sometimes celebrated the restoration of an aqueduct, because keeping water flowing was as political as it was practical. A city with dry fountains was a city grumbling against its leaders. A day in the life, let's imagine one day on a maintenance crew. Dawn breaks, painting the arches gold. A team gathers at the base of a hill where a small leak has been reported. Two men carry trowels and mortars. Another brings a lantern and rope. They joke as they walk, their sandals kicking up dust. The sun climbs higher as they climb down a shaft, entering the cool darkness. Inside the channel, their lantern casts long shadows. The sound of water echoes softly. They find the crack, scrape away old plaster, and carefully press new mortars into place. The youngest worker hums a tune to pass the time. By mid-afternoon, the job's done. They emerge blinking into the sunlight, stretch their stiff backs, and share bread under an olive tree. Tomorrow, another small repair will call them. The city above will drink and bathe in blissful ignorance of the quiet heroes who keep the water coming. Legacy of care? That's the hidden magic of Roman aqueducts. Their survival today isn't just about clever design. It's about centuries of diligent care. Bridges, tunnels, channels, all of them endured because ordinary people showed up, day after day, to sweep, patch, and polish. The arches you admire in a photo aren't frozen in time, the result of countless hands making sure water never stopped flowing. The aqueduct's long journey across hills, valleys, and tunnels is finally over. The water has made it to the city's edge, shimmering in the sunlight like a triumphant marathon runner. But now comes the tricky part. Where does all that water actually go? Rome didn't just dump it in one big puddle and hope for the best. They had a whole system to divide, direct, and deliver it like an ancient plumbing network with surprisingly good customer service. The Castellum Divisorium. The water traffic cop at the city's edge stood the Castellum Divisorium, a fancy Latin name for what was essentially a big water tank and splitter. Imagine a sturdy stone box with multiple outlets. Water flowed in from the aqueduct, swirled gently, and then spilled out through several pipes, leading to different parts of the city. It was the Roman version of a traffic circle, but with less yelling and fewer runaway carts. The Castellum had channels for three main priorities. Public fountains, because thirsty citizens and gossipy neighbors needed their water. Bathhouses, Rome's pride and joy, where steam and soap were serious business. Private customers, the wealthy households and businesses who could afford a legal connection. Sometimes extra pipes led to gardens, mills, or workshops. A well-run castella meant everyone got their share except for the occasional sneaky pipe tapper, but we'll get to those. Public fountains. The social network of Rome. Public fountains were everywhere. Picture a bustling corner of the city, vendors shouting, children chasing each other, and in the middle, a stone fountain gurgling happily. People gathered here not just to collect water, but to chat, trade news, and show off their best tunics. The sound of splashing water was as much a part of Rome's soundtrack as the clatter of sandals on cobblestones. Fountains weren't fancy, most were simple basins, but they were vital. They kept the poorest Romans supplied with fresh water, and their constant overflow cleaned the streets. City without fountains would smell. Let's just say you wouldn't want to visit. Bathhouses, the water-hungry giants. Bathhouses were the celebrities of Roman water culture. Big ones like Caracalla S could guzzle water like a marathon runner at mile 20. Water flowed into giant cisterns, then into pools of varying temperatures, hot, warm, and cold. Heated rooms filled with steam while bathers lounged and gossiped. The aqueduct made all this possible, turning bathing from a chore into a social event. Imagine the relief of stepping into a steamy caldarium after a long day at the forum. And imagine the maintenance workers outside, checking pipes and murmuring prayers that the flow wouldn't falter, because nothing would ruin a senator's mood faster than a lukewarm bath. Private connections. Luxury at home. Wealthy families could apply for private water rights. A legal connection to the aqueduct was marked by a lead pipe stamped with official seals to prevent fraud. These pipes carried water to courtyard fountains, kitchen basins, and sometimes even private baths. Having your own water supply was a serious status symbol. If your neighbor's fountain splashed louder than yours, you might suspect he bribed someone at the water office. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some clever folks drilled illegal taps into the pipes, stealing water under the cover of night. Inspectors patrolled for these water thieves, plugging holes and issuing fines. Somewhere in Rome, a sneaky merchant probably muttered, "Just a tiny leak they'll never notice," right before a fine arrived on his doorstep. Overflow and street cleaning, the Romans hated waste, but they also knew clean streets mattered. Overflow water from fountains and baths was directed into drains that flushed filth away. It was like having a built-in street cleaning service. The same overflow also fed ornamental gardens, mills, or even small fish ponds. Water in Rome didn't just stop after quenching thirst, it kept working. Right up until it trickled into the Tiber. The soundtrack of a city alive. Close your eyes and imagine walking through ancient Rome on a summer afternoon. You'd hear the splash of fountains at every corner, the hiss of steam escaping bathhouse pipes, and the gurgle of water racing under cobblestones. It was the quiet heartbeat of the city, keeping everyone washed, fed, and connected. An ordinary day extraordinarily supplied. Picture an ordinary Roman woman, Julia, stepping out with her clay jar. She greets neighbors at the fountain, dips her jar into the cool stream, and shares a rumor about the senator's new villa. Meanwhile, across town, a baker fills buckets to knead dough, while a wealthy merchant relaxes under the spray of his private fountain. None of them think about the engineers or workers who keep the water flowing. They just trust the system, as steady as the sunrise. Legacy of urban flow, this distribution system didn't just keep Rome comfortable, made the city possible. Without reliable water, the baths would close, the forums would stink, and disease would spread. Instead, thanks to those aqueducts and their clever networks of pipes, Rome thrived as a bustling, sophisticated metropolis. Even today, when you see a ruined castellum or a fountain base in an old Roman city, you're looking at the quiet brilliance of water management. The aqueduct's job wasn't done when it reached the city, it only just begun. The aqueduct has reached the heart of the city and passed through the Castellum Divisorium. Now it's time for the real stars of Roman water culture. The fountains, the baths, and those fancy private pipes. This is where the water earns its applause and maybe a little jealousy. Fountains, Rome's living rooms. Walk any Roman street and you'll almost trip over a fountain. These weren't just decoration, they were lifelines. Picture a modest stone basin with a simple spout, endlessly gurgling. People gathered here like moths to a flame. Neighbors exchanged gossip, kids splashed their hands, and street dogs pretended to be statues so they could sneak a sip. The fountains were designed with overflow channels, so extra water didn't go to waste. It trickled down side streets, sweeping away dust and crumbs. Rome's cleanliness wasn't perfect. Don't sniff too hard near a tannery. But the fountains kept the city fresher than most ancient towns. Imagine arriving at dusk. Torches flicker. The fountain's soft burble mixes with distant lyre music, and the city feels almost cozy. For a place famous for gladiators and political drama, the fountains whispered, "Hey, relax. We've got enough water for everyone." Bathhouses, the social superstars. If fountains were the city's living rooms, bathhouses were its theaters. These weren't little wooden tubs. They were sprawling complexes, with towering ceilings and echoing halls. The baths of Caracalla, for instance, could fit thousands of bathers. Step inside. Warm light filters through high windows. Marble columns line vast pools. Steam drifts through the caldarium hot room, where friends debate politics or whisper juicy rumors. The tepidarium warm room is perfect for lingering. And the frigidarium cold plunge will jolt you awake faster than a bucket of ice water. Bathhouses weren't just for cleaning. They had libraries, snack bars, and exercise yards. You could soak, snack, read, and stretch all on one admission fee. And behind the scenes, a small army of workers managed the water flow, heating systems, and drainage. Think of them as backstage crew for the greatest show in town: relaxation. Private connections. Ancient plumbing flex only the wealthy could pipe aqueduct water directly into their homes. These lucky few installed lead pipes stamped with official marks to prevent sneaky tampering. In a quiet villa courtyard, a small fountain might gurgle beside a citrus tree. In the kitchen, water flowed for cooking and cleaning. Some villas even had private bathrooms. Imagine bragging about that at a dinner party. Private water wasn't just convenient. It was a status symbol. The louder your fountain splashed, the more your guests would raise their eyebrows in admiration. Of course, where there's status, there's always a little scandal. Inspectors roamed the city, checking pipes for illegal taps. Somewhere in Rome, a merchant probably muttered, "It's only a small pipe," right before paying a hefty fine. The balancing act managing the flow between public and private needs was tricky. Bathhouses could gulp water like a thirsty elephant, and a drought could spark arguments. The city's water officials had to ensure fountains stayed full, baths stayed steamy, and rich citizens didn't hog the supply. It was like juggling amphorae while walking on cobblestones, yet somehow the system worked for centuries. The combination of careful planning, regular maintenance, and a little divine luck kept water moving day and night, a day in the life. Picture a typical afternoon. Julia, our fictional Roman friend, meets her neighbor at the fountain. They fill jars, chat about the senator's new sandals, and watch kids sail paper boats downstream. Across town, bathhouse doors creak open as steam billows out. Senators, bakers, and blacksmiths alike step inside to unwind. Meanwhile, in a quiet villa, a wealthy matron enjoys the gentle splash of her courtyard fountain, thinking how lucky she is not to lug water jars. The sound of water is everywhere, trickling, splashing, echoing. It's a kind of music, softening the hard edges of city life. Beyond comfort, civic pride. Fountains and baths weren't just utilities, they were symbols of Roman greatness. Visitors from other lands marveled at the abundance. In a world where many towns relied on muddy wells, Rome's endless water seemed almost magical. Hosting a guest? Lead them past your local fountain, or, better yet, to the nearest bathhouse. Rome's waterworks did the bragging for you. Why it matters. The brilliance of these systems wasn't in their grandeur alone, but in their accessibility. A poor family could wash at a public fountain just as easily as a senator could soak in marble luxury. Water, at least in principle, belonged to everyone. That shared access made Rome feel like a community, even when politics and power could divide it. The echo in modern cities. Today's city fountains and spas owe a quiet debt to the Roman model. Every time you hear a fountain splash in a plaza or step into a public pool, you're hearing echoes of Rome. They set the standard. Water isn't just a resource, it's a connector, comfort, and sometimes a little bit of showing off. The Roman aqueduct system didn't stay perfect all by itself. Water, stone, and time have a way of making trouble, and Rome was not about to let its lifeline crumble. Enter the unsung heroes of the empire, the maintenance crews and the inspectors. They weren't glamorous like gladiators or senators, but without them, the baths would run dry. The fountains would sputter, and the city would smell. Let's just say, less than inviting. The silent watchers of the water. Rome employed curators, aquarium officials, whose entire job was to oversee the water supply. These folks were like ancient civil engineers mixed with modern health inspectors. They didn't wear capes or laurels, but they carried authority. Beneath them worked teams of skilled laborers, stonemasons, pipe fitters, cleaners, and even divers. Yes, divers. Who waded into channels to clear debris. Picture a crew trudging out at dawn, their sandals crunching gravel, tools slung over their shoulders. They followed the aqueduct line, checking for cracks, leaks, or sneaky unauthorized taps. A small drip could turn into a big disaster, so they were always on alert. Cleaning the channels. Aqueduct channels weren't just open streams of crystal clear water. Over time, minerals built up along the walls, algae grew in the shade, and small critters thought they'd found a five-star riverfront home. To keep water flowing smoothly, crews periodically drained sections of the aqueduct for cleaning. Workers scraped lime deposits off the walls, cleared out leaves and twigs, and sometimes fished out an unlucky frog. It was messy, wet, and probably smelled like a swamp, but it kept the system healthy. If you think unclogging a modern drain is annoying, imagine doing it on a structure stretching miles across hills and valleys, fixing cracks and breakages. Stone is tough, but earthquakes, shifting soil, and sheer age could crack an aqueduct's arches or channels. When that happened, masons set to work with chisels and mortars, carefully patching the damage. Sometimes they had to rebuild entire sections, all while ensuring the rest of the system kept working. It was like performing open-heart surgery on a patient who had to keep walking. For urgent repairs, crews built temporary wooden troughs to reroute the flow. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Rome could not afford a dry day. Inspectors and water thieves now about those sneaky taps. Water was precious, and some crafty citizens tried to steal it by drilling illegal holes into pipes. Inspectors, known as aquari, patrolled the city to catch them. They examined pipes for unauthorized branches or missing seals. If they found evidence of theft, fines were issued, and sometimes the offender's pipe was cut off entirely. Imagine a merchant insisting that extra fountain, it just appeared overnight. While an inspector raises an eyebrow, the Romans even stamped official pipes with markings so fraud could be spotted at a glance. It was a mix of bureaucracy and detective work, centuries before Sherlock Holmes. The record keeper's every inspection and repair was logged. Romans loved record scrolls, tablets, inscriptions, anything to track what was done and by whom. If a section of aqueduct collapsed, there would be a paper trail, or rather a papyrus trail, detailing the repairs. These records weren't just for accountability. They also helped future crews know what to watch out for. Safety first, well, mostly. Maintenance work wasn't glamorous or always safe. Imagine balancing on a high aqueduct arch with a bucket of mortar while the wind whistles past your tunic. A slip could mean a very bad day. Still, these workers took pride in their craft. The fact that some aqueducts are still standing today is a testament to their skill and care. A day on the job. Let's follow a fictional worker, Marcus, the mason, on a typical day. At sunrise, he meets his crew outside the city gates. They walk a few miles to a section of aqueduct that's been leaking. Marcus climbs a ladder to inspect a crack, muttering about mischievous gods. His friend Lucius jokes that maybe Neptune wanted an extra fountain. After hours of chiseling and patching, they test the flow steady and strong. The city's baths will stay warm tonight, and the fountains will keep singing. On the way back, an inspector stops to check a suspicious pipe behind a bakery. The baker swears innocence, but the inspector finds an unmarked lead tap. A fine is issued, the illegal tap is removed, and the baker sighs, realizing he'll have to fetch water the honest way. Quiet heroes of an empire, these maintenance crews rarely made it into grand speeches or triumphal arches, but their work was essential. Without them, the aqueducts would crumble, and Rome's glory would dry up literally. The next time you picture Rome's marble baths or sparkling fountains, spare a thought for the workers with wet sandals and sore backs who made it all possible. Legacy in stone and water. Even today, archaeologists study the repairs and markings left by Roman crews. The patched sections, extra supports, and inscriptions are like whispers across time. We were here. We cared for this. It's a reminder that even the grandest achievements depend on quiet, steady labor. Rome wasn't just about grand arches and marble baths. It was also about rules. Lots of rules. You can't build a water empire without a little paperwork. If aqueducts were the veins of the city, then Roman water law was the heartbeat that kept it fair, or at least tried to. Let's wander through the world of ancient water rights, where senators debated fountains, inspectors patrolled pipes and bribes. Well, bribes probably happened too. Who owned the water? Technically, all water flowing through aqueducts belonged to the state. That meant the people of Rome, or more accurately, the emperor, decided how it was used. But just because it was public didn't mean everyone could grab a bucket whenever they wanted. The Romans treated water as both a common good and a valuable resource. Public fountains were free for all. Bathhouses often charged small fees, which helped fund maintenance. But if you wanted a private supply pipe to your house, you needed official permission. No sneaky hoses sticking out of the aqueduct, lest you wanted a hefty fine. The curator aquarum, water boss extraordinaire at the top of the water hierarchy, was the curator aquarum, a high-ranking official in charge of the entire system. Think of him as the ultimate plumber-bureaucrat hybrid. He oversaw repairs, inspected flow rates, and approved new connections. Being curator aquarum was prestigious. Emperors didn't give this job to just anyone. Single mistake could turn bathhouses cold and senators grumpy. Below him were assistants, inspectors, and scribes who recorded everything. Rome loved paperwork almost as much as it loved bread and circuses. Permits, pipes, and seals. Private water rights came with lead pipes, stamped with official seals. These seals were like the Roman version of a license plate, showing the connection was legal. If an inspector found an unmarked pipe, they'd know someone was cheating. Lead wasn't just chosen for convenience, it was easy to shape, and the stamps made forgery harder. Homeowners applied for permits through the city administration. A successful application meant your courtyard fountain could splash proudly. A denied one meant you'd be lugging buckets from the public fountain like everyone else. Water thieves in ancient crime scenes, despite the rules, Some people couldn't resist free water. They'd drill secret holes or install hidden taps. Inspectors, called aqueducts, patrolled the system like detectives, sniffing out suspicious leaks. When caught, thieves faced fines or even losing their right to water. Imagine an inspector following a wet trail behind a bakery and discovering a hidden pipe. The baker protests. "That pipe? Oh, Neptune must have blessed my oven." The inspector just rolls his eyes, notes the infraction, and seals the tap. Priority users in politics, not all water users were equal. Public fountains and bathhouses had priority, while private connections could be restricted during shortages. But politics always found a way in. A well-connected senator might suggest that his villa's bath stays filled, drought or no drought. Emperors themselves sometimes meddled, sponsoring grand new baths or fountains to win public favor. Water wasn't just a utility, it was a political tool. When an emperor opened a new bathhouse, it wasn't just about hygiene, it was a statement. "Look at me, your generous provider of steamy relaxation." Protecting the sources? Roman law also protected aqueduct sources. Springs feeding the aqueducts were often surrounded by protected zones where farming or construction was restricted. This kept the water clean and the flow steady. You couldn't just build a pigsty next to a sacred spring. You could try, but the fines would ruin your day. Boundary disputes. Ancient neighbors arguing. Sometimes disputes arose between neighbors over water access. If a private pipe crossed another's land or drained a shared fountain too quickly, tempers flared. Magistrates would mediate, scrolls would be consulted, and someone would leave grumbling. It's comforting in a way to know that even 2,000 years ago, people argued about plumbing, public good versus private wealth. Rome's system tried imperfectly to balance the common good with the desires of the rich. Public fountains symbolized the city's promise to care for everyone, while private connections reminded people of the privileges wealth could buy. This tension was unique to Rome. You can see echoes of it today, whenever cities debate water rights or infrastructure spending. A day in the records office. Picture a scribe named Gaius, sitting in a stuffy office near the Forum. His job? Recording every water permit, fine, and complaint. He scratches notes onto wax tablets, muttering about another illegal tap near the Aventine Hill. A courier rushes in with a report. A bathhouse is using more water than allocated. Gaius sighs, sharpens his stylus, and starts yet another scroll. He'll never be famous, but his notes keep Rome's fountains gurgling. The legacy of Roman water law, the Roman legal approach to water influenced later European systems, medieval cities, Renaissance towns, and even some modern regulations trace their roots back to these ancient practices. They understood that water isn't just a resource, it's a shared lifeline. Next time you turn on a faucet, imagine an ancient inspector squinting at your pipes, making sure you're not siphoning extra water. It's a reminder that infrastructure is only as good as the rules that protect it. Even the mightiest aqueducts can't escape time's slow march. For centuries, Rome's water network flowed like clockwork arches standing proud, fountains singing in the squares. But empires rise, empires fall, and even aqueducts get tired. Let's stroll through the story of their decline, patchwork repairs, and surprising survival. The first signs of trouble. Rome at its peak was a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. But as the empire began to wobble, the aqueducts started showing their age. Political instability meant fewer funds for maintenance. If the curator aquarium couldn't pay enough workers, little cracks became big leaks. Think of a leaky roof you keep meaning to fix, except your whole city depends on it. Earthquakes and invaders. Nature wasn't always kind. Earthquakes rattled Italy, shaking stone arches loose. Heavy rains caused landslides that buried channels. And then came human trouble. Invading tribes realized that cutting an aqueduct could weaken a city's defenses. During the Gothic Wars in the 6th century, sieges often began with axe blows to aqueduct bridges. No water meant no baths, no fountains, and no morale. Emergency fixes. Even in chaotic times, people tried to keep the water flowing. Local masons patched cracks with whatever materials they could find. Wooden troughs sometimes replaced broken arches. A ruined span of aqua marcia. Just build a quick detour and hope it holds. These repairs weren't always elegant, but they were clever and they kept Rome's heart beating a little longer. Shifting priorities. As the empire fractured, fewer people lived in the old capital. Bathhouses closed, fountains dried, and neighborhoods shrank. Smaller populations meant fewer voices demanding clean water. Wells and rivers replaced the once glorious aqueduct streams. By the Middle Ages, many aqueducts were silent, their arches serving as scenic perches for nesting birds. Imagine a medieval traveler passing under a crumbling aqueduct. To him, it wasn't a symbol of an advanced civilization, it was just a giant ruin, useful maybe for shade or scavenging stones for a barn. The once mighty water highway had become part of the landscape, like an abandoned road, forgotten by time, reuse and recycling. Romans and their descendants were practical. Stones from broken aqueducts were hauled away to build churches, walls, and houses. Lead pipes were melted down for other uses. An aqueduct wasn't sacred if it wasn't working, it was a quarry. Ironically, this recycling helped preserve some sections. The leftover fragments became too broken to bother dismantling, so they stayed standing for us to admire today. A few survivors keep flowing, not all aqueducts went dry. Some, like Aqua Virgo, continued to supply parts of Rome well into the Middle Ages. Even today, Aqua Virgo still feeds the Trevi Fountain. Picture that, a 2,000-year-old waterway quietly keeping coins and wishes afloat in the modern city. It's a reminder of Roman engineering's durability, Renaissance rediscovery. Fast forward to the Renaissance. Artists, architects, and scholars looked at the old aqueducts with fresh eyes. To them, these weren't ruins to steal from, they were masterpieces to study. Engineers examined the remaining channels, measuring slopes and arches. Some aqueducts were even repaired or rerouted to serve growing Renaissance cities. The Aqua Felice, for instance, was revived in the 16th century to bring water back to Rome. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci sketching an old aqueduct, marveling at its geometry. For him, these ruins whispered secrets of proportion, strength, and beauty. A symbol of endurance through wars, neglect, and weather, many aqueducts simply refused to disappear. Their silhouettes still stride across valleys in France, Spain, and Italy. Tourists snap photos, hikers trace their paths, and modern engineers shake their heads in admiration. The stones may be cracked, but the design endures a kind of architectural stubbornness. Lessons from the past, the decline of the aqueducts isn't just a sad story, it's a warning and a lesson. Even brilliant infrastructure needs care. Rome's engineers built for centuries, but without maintenance and stability, even the best systems falter. Modern cities face similar challenges: aging pipes, crumbling bridges, and tight budgets. The aqueducts remind us that great works need constant attention, or they become picturesque ruins for future generations to gawk at. The ruins speak. Picture yourself standing at Pont du Gard in southern France, late afternoon sun painting the arches gold. Or imagine walking under the Aqua Claudia outside Rome, hearing birds chirp where once water rushed. These ruins don't feel dead, they hum with memory. You can almost hear the splash of water, the chatter of workers, the distant laughter of bathers. The aqueducts may not carry water anymore, but they still carry stories, survival against odds. Despite earthquakes, wars, and centuries of neglect, enough of these giants remain to impress anyone. It's almost as if the stones themselves refuse to give up. The next time you see one, don't just admire its size, admire its stubbornness. The aqueducts survived emperors, barbarians, and weather. They've been part of the skyline longer than some countries have existed. When you drink from a faucet, watch water dance in a city fountain, or drive over a bridge, you're bumping into the ghost of a Roman aqueduct. Even if you don't see a single arch or stone channel, their fingerprints are all over modern engineering. Rome's old waterworks didn't just fade into history, they shaped the world's infrastructure, philosophy of design, and even our idea of what a city should feel like. Engineering principles that still flow Roman. Aqueduct builders figured out the perfect gentle slope for water to move, steep enough to flow, shallow enough not to erode. Today's civil engineers still calculate gradients the same way. Gravity-fed water systems, like those in some mountain towns or rural areas, echo Roman wisdom. Let nature do the work. Why waste energy on pumps when the land itself can help? Their use of arches also set the standard. Those curving spans weren't just pretty, they distributed weight brilliantly. Every time you walk under a railway viaduct or admire a stone bridge, You're looking at an idea borrowed directly from Rome. Cities that learned to breathe before Rome, cities often clustered around rivers or wells. Rome showed that, with clever engineering, you could grow a city almost anywhere. The concept of urban planning supplying fresh water, removing waste, and spacing public amenities took a giant leap forward. Modern municipal water systems, sewer networks, and even fire hydrants trace their roots to Roman logic. A healthy city is a hydrated city. Public fountains in Paris or plazas in Madrid. They're spiritual descendants of Roman basins where neighbors swapped gossip while filling jars. Inspiring Renaissance revival, the Renaissance rediscovered Rome's genius. Architects like Palladio and engineers like Domenico Fontana studied crumbling aqueducts as textbooks in stone. Their repairs and reimaginings brought water back to cities like Rome and Florence, even Baroque fountains like the Trevi. Their existence to aqueducts revived during this era. It wasn't just about utility, it was about beauty. The idea that infrastructure could be elegant, that a water supply could double as a work of art, came straight from the Romans. Today, when architects argue that even a bridge should have character, they're channeling an old Roman sensibility. Influence on global engineering, the Romans' methods traveled far beyond Italy. Spanish aqueducts inspired designs in the Americas during colonial times. French engineers studied Pont du Gard when building canals. Even modern dam builders look back to Roman concretes, some of which has outlasted our advanced mixtures. Gravity-fed irrigation systems in parts of Asia and Europe, though independently developed, have borrowed Roman tweaks over the centuries. The aqueduct became a symbol of reliability. If Rome could feed 1 million people with flowing water, maybe modern cities could too. Modern concrete versus Roman magic, here's a twist. Roman concrete sometimes outperforms ours. Recent studies show that their mix of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater allowed cracks to heal over time as minerals formed new bonds. Modern engineers are experimenting with similar mixes to create self-repairing concrete. So, 2,000 years later, we're still learning tricks from ancient masons in dusty tunics. The aesthetic legacy: look at many big cities. Fountains in parks, water features in malls, grand bridges over rivers, they all echo Rome's idea that water should delight as well as serve. Even sci-fi cities in movies often have glittering, aqueduct-like structures or hovering fountains. The Romans taught us that practical infrastructure can also stir the soul. A modern walk among ruins. Imagine walking along the Aqua Claudia's remains outside Rome, then hopping on a train and seeing similar arches carrying rail lines. Or sipping from a public fountain in Madrid fed by underground pipes, just as Romans did millennia ago. The line from past to present is so clear you can almost hear a Roman engineer chuckling. I told you it would last. Quiet influence on everyday life. We don't often thank ancient builders when we shower or water a garden, but maybe we should. Their systems shaped expectations. Clean water as a public right, not a privilege. Even legal debates about water rights in modern courts have echoes of Roman rules that balanced public and private needs. Lessons for the future: Rome's aqueducts also serve as a cautionary tale. They thrived when maintained and collapsed when neglected. Modern cities face similar choices: invest in infrastructure or risk disaster. The Roman example suggests that clever engineering can last centuries. If we care for it, imagine a future archaeologist studying our pipelines. Will they marvel at our materials or shake their heads at shortcuts? Rome reminds us. Build for the long term, or your great works become pretty ruins for tourists. It's the eternal flow. Some aqueducts still carry water today. Aqua Virgo, after 2 millennia, still feeds the Trevi fountain. Every coin toss, there is a tribute not just to a Baroque masterpiece, but to Roman engineering that refuses to quit. The water you hear splashing is the same that once cooled ancient fountains and soothed tired feet after a day in the Forum, closing the circle. As we close this tour, picture the first Roman engineer marking out a line on a hillside, imagining an arch that would outlast kings. Now picture a modern city skyline, threaded with bridges, pipes, and fountains. Across centuries, the flow continues quiet, dependable, beautiful. The aqueducts aren't just relics, they're living teachers. Every splash in a fountain, every gurgle of a pipe, every elegant bridge arch is their legacy. 2,000 years later, the water still runs, and Rome is still whispering, build well and your work will outlive you. And that's where our Roman aqueduct tour comes full circle, right back to the world we live in now. The arches might be ruins, but their ideas are still holding up our bridges and filling our fountains. Thanks for wandering through history with me tonight. If you're not already asleep, go ahead and give this video a like, share it with a fellow history dreamer, and subscribe so you'll always have a quiet story waiting. Till next time, may your dreams be calm, your water clear, and your night as steady as a Roman arch.